Good day to all of you. Welcome back to the third session on the promise and peril of globalization. In our first, I guess it was a preliminary session, zero session, I think probably it would be good to call that one. We've sketched, Doug has sketched a bit historical developments of which globalization is a part and developments leading to globalization. And then the next session with Tony Blair, we talked about the stakes in getting it right about faith and globalization. Why does this thing matter at all? Now we direct our attention primarily to globalization and examine peril and promise of globalization. Then we'll shift attention to religions, examine transformations of faith and secularization thesis. And then we'll try to look at interrelation between the two around the set of particular issues. So that's roughly the outline of the whole course, and we are at the very beginning of it. Now, Promise and Peril of Globalization is the title for us today, and it has a kind of ambivalent, globalization has kind of ambivalent character. What I want to do here, being a theologian, is to pick up of some of the things that we've been discussing about significance of faith, and then talk about promise and peril of faiths. Because there's also the kind of deep ambivalence of faiths, which was noted on the sidelines, but nonetheless, which is a very prominent and important piece in our discussions as we are leading them. So I don't need to repeat much more about the significance of faiths. It's contested. The issue is contested to what degree faiths are significant. And if you come from the tradition, say, of Karl Marx, then you, or somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche, you'll think of faiths as kind of epiphenomenal. They're derivative. They basically don't cause ultimately anything, but they're the consequences of something. Then you'll have a certain view of the significance of faiths. But and that's kind of one general position if one takes, but also more on pragmatic grounds. People have always asked me, because I come from former Yugoslavia, they want to figure out what's happening there, and so that the question always ends up being, well, what is it? Was it about economy? Was it about politics? Was it about land? Was it about religion? And basically, I said all of the above. And I have coined in these conversations a little phrase which said, all monocausal explanations are suspect, especially if you have complex events of this sort as eruption of violence in former Yugoslavia. Let's not try to reduce it to a single cause. So there may be multiple causes at work. We're interested, or at least aspect of interest of ours is here, significance of faiths in some of those events for ill and for good, which takes me then to the question of promise and peril of faith. So we can grant for the sake of the argument that faiths are significant, but then how do they function? How do these faiths function? And there are definite disagreements on that question, and there are definite ambivalences also of the role of faith. The disagreements, some consider faiths obviously as a force for good, others consider faiths as a significant force for ill in the world today. Believers, clearly, mostly would argue that faiths are somehow a force for good, at least if you look at the heart of the faith. Some humanists also, if they're not kind of relatively strong atheists, might agree also that faiths in a not quite adequate way express some of the fundamental aspirations of human beings, moral codes that and are able to motivate people to follow those, right? So they can see possibly faith as force of good. Others, of course, critics would claim that faith is a force for ill. Faiths are irrational, and irrationality by its very nature is a force for ill, and critics might argue also that faiths are by their very nature violent. And there are such accounts of religion, which for instance would suggest that the heart of all faiths lies something like the combat myth. and that combat myth structures how the faith functions as a whole in the world, and it's not then an accident that in situations of conflict, faiths end up generating or reinforcing at least violence. Yeah. So there's these disagreements, but there's also the ambivalence of the faith itself, right? Even those who see that faiths are at their heart a force for good agree that faiths sometimes, maybe even often, when as they're practiced concretely, function for ill, right? So that they are forces for good, and they are at the same time forces of for ill, as concretely practiced as lived faiths. And in this class, we will be primarily interested in this concrete side of faiths, in lived side of faiths, rather than simply in theoretical constructs about faiths or debates about rationality of faiths or anything of that sort. So there's this ambivalence of faith as concretely practiced, but there's also a second kind of ambivalence, I think, which is very, very interesting to note. It stems from the fact that faiths themselves are of such character that they offer perspectives from which to judge certain actions as good or ill, right? They are overarching interpretations of life. Therefore, there are vantage points of assessing behavior. So a particular act and particular cause may look either as good, salutary, or not, depending on the concrete shape of faith that one takes as a standpoint for evaluating. So for 9/11, for instance, it matters profoundly whether you share bin Laden's religious convictions and consider all who disagree with you, if they're Muslims, as apostates, if they are non-Muslims as infidels. It matters very much for deciding whether the attack on World Trade Center is to be described as deplorable violence or is to be described as part of just struggle, right? That's a perspectival judgment. And for instance, we had the other case, was Jubilee, right? Well, it may matter. I'm not sure whether it really does, but it may matter in how you assess this, whether you are a person guided solely by utilitarian principles, or if you believe that we should feed the poor irrespective of the consequences of that action for future economic development and so forth, right? It may depend on your position how you evaluate the role of religion in this case. And there are some, I think it's part of our case study, right? Some people who say, well, all these good-minded people, right, who are wreaking havoc on things by trying to improve the world, right? If you're a person of faith, you might have a quite different perspective on that, and there's a debate about this. I think it's also important as we think about faiths and their ambivalence is to note that at least the way we are using the term faiths, that is not as a kind of individual convictions, not as kind of private spirituality, but as part of faith traditions, but as a kind of overarching interpretations of life that guide human behavior as part of the large faith traditions. If you look at these, then you see that some of these ambivalences and disagreements are embedded in faiths themselves. One way to look at faiths is to see them as centuries-long, sometimes extended traditions of arguments about the goods which constitute that faith. Often people who look at faiths on the outside, they see kind of a monolithic structure, pronouncements of somebody from the cave or somebody from Vatican or from wherever else, and that seems to kind of set in stone what faith is. But if you look more carefully, you see centuries, indeed, long traditions of debate, how faith should be understood. And I think I mentioned in this class, and there's a phrase of David Martin, who was supposed to be with us, sociologist from School of Economics, emeritus now, London School of Economics, who talks about faiths having repertoires, where they take certain elements are played up, other elements are pushed into the background, and that's part and parcel of the long argument within those faith traditions, so that each faith develops over time. It has a variety of expressions depending on larger cultural environment, and the specific conditions under which faith live shape the forms of arguments and positions that faith people take. So that each faith is then internally differentiated in itself and constitutes a tradition of debate. So that much on the promise and peril of faiths. They obviously have perils. Those are visible very clearly. Some of us think that they also have certain promise, but that's a very much contested and debatable issue. Now, the theme for today is promise and peril of globalization. And what I intend to do is simply highlight some of the issues from the readings and then let Professor Ray and our guest Ian Shapiro to continue discussing these themes. Procedure for today is going to be, as always, when we have guests. Tony Blair is not a guest, right? When we have guests in classroom, that we have roughly each of us teachers, Professor Ray and myself, make 15 minutes comments, then guests comes for another 15 minutes, and then about 20 minutes of discussion, and then the guest will be taken away from you, whisked away, so you can barrage him or her with questions anymore. But the other flip side of this is if you're interested in pursuing questions specifically to our guests, 20 minutes is your chance. And I hope that in the interest of time, all of us would think carefully how we formulate our questions, be brief as we formulate, and then run with the thing. Okay, promise and peril of globalization. Well, there's certain kind of ambivalence to globalization itself, and you can see how these have been analyzed in the texts that we have read for today. It's interesting also that some of the texts speak of multiple globalizations almost, right? They use phrases like economic globalization, cultural globalization. I take it that's a short, right? Short for economic aspects of globalization, because if you take those as kind of distinct, you will miss the deep interrelationship between all of these. Economic aspect of globalization, central issue that was highlighted was the relationship between wealth and poverty and ambiguity around that. On the one hand, globalization seems to lift people out of poverty, but then the question becomes of the critics of globalization, can it do so while respecting equality and some of the significant social norms of justice? Environment was an issue that was highlighted, right? On the one hand, it creates global environmental awareness, but on the other hand, partly that awareness was created by the damage that was done to the environment. Cultural aspects of globalization, I think elements that have been highlighted earlier in our readings were the questions of group identity, questions of relationship between homogenizing tendencies and kind of heterogenizing. Is that a word? It's a sketchy word, right? Differentiating, right? Apadura uses it, I think, but I'm not quite sure whether it was a really word. So, and we've dealt a bit with this. It was in the backdrop of Huntington reading and so forth. I think one of the things that hasn't been discussed so much and comes first time in our reading, and that bears, I think, some reflection upon, and that is the question of cultural reproduction. Do you recall that text toward the end of Apadurai's piece, where he asked the question, so that globalization creates settings characterized, one, by high pace of change, right? So over time, the change happens in accelerated way of change, but also environments saturated with diversity, right? And then he asked the question, but how do you form cultural habits, stable cultural habits, right? Internalized discipline, character traits, kind of internalization of values and so forth, right? Able to sustain people in a complex and rapidly changing cultural environment. I think that's a very interesting question to ask, and I think it's connected also with the main topic of our seminar as a whole, relationship between faiths and globalization, because often just because globalization processes aren't able to form stable, kind of sustainable cultural traits, faiths come in and then provide a framework for people from which they can stand as they face cultural change. And then finally, and I think that's going to lead into what Professor Shapiro is going to speak, is the political aspects of globalization. On the one hand, interest in creation of global institutions, and on the other hand, the relationship between these global institutions and national governments, their relative strength, their ability, both ability to express the will of the people, ability to guarantee security to the people, and in some of the texts that we've read, their ability to provide safety networks, especially for those who suffer under the consequences of the perils of globalization. That was some of the issues, I think, that were raised in terms of promise and peril of globalization. That's all I have to say for today, and I give the floor to Professor Wright.